They left the bedroom door open a crack the night they decided I was already dead. I wasn't. I was lying in a hospital bed they'd rented and wheeled into my own house 6 days out from a stroke that had taken the strength from my right side and, they believed, the sense out of my head. My right hand wouldn't close all the way. My speech came slow, the words arriving a half-second behind the thought. But my ears worked fine. And my ears were the only thing I'd ever truly needed. I'm a luthier, 68 years old, and for 50 of them I built and repaired stringed instruments. Violins, violas, cellos, in a workshop behind our house outside Saratoga Springs. People think it's a quaint little trade. It isn't. A cello is a living argument between tension and silence. There's a little dowel of spruce inside, no thicker than a pencil, wedged upright between the top and the back. We call it the soundpost. The French call it la main, the soul. Move it a millimeter and the whole instrument goes mute or sings. Nobody who looks at a cello from the outside even knows it's in there. That detail is going to matter, so hold on to it. That night I heard my wife's voice come down the hall like cold water under a door. He's out. The aide gave him the second pill an hour ago. 41 years I'd been married to that voice. I knew its warmth, its laugh, the way it softened when she was tired. This was none of those. This was a voice doing arithmetic. Then, my son, I just don't want him waking up in the middle of it. He won't. And if he does, what's he going to do? He can barely say his own name. I'd raised that boy from the time he was 3. Taught him to whittle. Taught him to drive. Sat in a folding chair through every miserable little league inning. He won't. He could barely say his own name. I felt something behind my breastbone. Not the stroke this time. Something older and worse. Twist and go still. A third voice. A man's. Smooth, unhurried. The kind of voice that sells you a car you can't afford and makes you thank him. The petition's already drafted. Once the court signs off on the conservatorship, your mother controls everything. The accounts, the property, the medical decisions, the house, the workshop, all of it. We file Thursday. The doctor's letter says, diminished capacity. It's clean. My wife laughed, and it was the laugh she used on the phone with the bank. 41 years married to a man who whittles, and now I finally get to be the one who decides. The man. Her man. I understood that fully now. The way you understand a chord is wrong before you can name the note. Said something low I didn't catch, and she laughed again. Close to him. The way she used to laugh close to me. I lay there and did not move. The room smelled of antiseptic and the gardenias she kept on the dresser. Flowers she knew I'd never liked. Flowers that smelled to me like the inside of a funeral home. I kept my breathing slow and shallow and even. I'd spent half a century training my hands to be still while I held a thing more delicate than a robin's egg. I could hold still now. Before I tell you what I did, and I did plenty, let me ask you to do something. If you've ever been written off, ever had someone you loved look at you and see a problem to be managed, type where you're watching from. I want to know I'm not the only one. Hit that subscribe button too, because what happened in that courtroom is not something you'll see coming. Now, where was I? The plan was a conservatorship. If you don't know the word, count yourself lucky. It's a legal proceeding where a court decides a grown adult can't manage his own affairs and hands that control to someone else. Built to protect the vulnerable. Used, more often than anyone admits, to strip them. My wife would become my conservator. She would own my signature. And the man with the smooth voice, I would learn, was the financial advisor she'd hired 2 years earlier to simplify our retirement. His name was Sebastian. He had simplified it right into accounts I'd never seen. I should explain how a man lets this happen. The comments are going to say I was a fool. That any husband paying attention would have known. So let me be honest with you. I wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention to spruce and maple and the precise angle of a scroll. Money bored me to tears. When my wife offered, decades ago, to handle the books, I was grateful the way a drowning man is grateful for a rope. I signed where she pointed. I never read a statement. I trusted her completely because trust to me was not a risk. It was the whole point of a marriage. That was my mistake, and I'll own it. But understand, it was the mistake of a man who loved, not the mistake of a fool. The morning after, I made a decision in that bed before the aide came in. They thought the stroke had hollowed me out. Fine. I would let them keep thinking it. I would be the emptiest, most pitiable old man they had ever seen. And while they admired their handiwork, I would take everything apart. It started with my voice. I let it slur worse than it was. When the aide asked if I wanted water, I let 3 seconds pass before I answered. And I made the answer wrong on purpose. Soup. When I meant water and watched her write something on her clipboard. When my wife came in with her morning mask of devotion on, smoothing my blanket, telling me how scared she'd been, how she only wanted me safe, I let a tear run down my cheek and I told her in a broken whisper that I didn't know what I'd do without her. I watched her believe it. I watched the small, satisfied curl at the corner of her mouth before she tucked it away. She kissed my forehead. Her lips were cold. That kiss did more for my recovery than any pill. Rage, it turns out, is a stimulant. Recovery is tedious work, and I was a model patient. I shuffled the hallway when they wanted me to shuffle. I ate the bland food my wife brought, and I thanked her for it with wet eyes. And every afternoon, when the house went quiet and she went to her yoga, I went to my workshop. They'd left it untouched. Why wouldn't they? To my wife, it was a shed full of dust and dead men's instruments. The place her husband disappeared to instead of being useful. She called my work your toys. She had no idea that the things on those walls were worth more than the house. She had no idea about the things on those walls were worth more than the house. She had no idea about the cello. But I'm getting ahead. In the workshop I could think, and I could do something else. 2 years back, before any of this, I'd had a violin go missing off the bench. A client's instrument, worth a fortune, vanished overnight. It turned up later. A delivery mix-up, but it had spooked me. And like the careful old fool I am, I'd installed a small recorder in the workshop, motion activated, tucked inside the empty case of a cello I kept on a stand by the window. Nobody knew it was there. I'd half forgotten it myself. I checked it. The battery was dead, but the slot was there. And here's where being a craftsman matters. I knew how to make a thing disappear inside another thing. I knew exactly how much room there is inside a cello, behind the falls, in the dark where the soundpost stands. That night I moved the recorder, fresh battery, into the body of an old cello I'd hung on the wall years ago, an instrument my wife had walked past 10,000 times without a glance. I ran a hairline wire to a switch I could trip with my useless right hand. Then I waited. It took 11 days. 11 days of being weak, of being grateful, of letting my son visit and pat my hand and call me Pop, in a voice that made me want to be sick. 11 days of watching Sebastian come and go in his good shoes, sitting at my kitchen table with my wife, the two of them bent over a laptop, planning the funeral of a man who wasn't dead. On the 12th day, they held a meeting in the living room. Sebastian, my wife, my son, and a fourth man with a leather folder, who turned out to be the lawyer drafting the petition. They thought I was asleep in my chair by the cold fireplace, where they parked me like furniture. I'd tripped the switch when the aide wheeled me in. I sat with my chin on my chest and my eyes nearly shut, and I listened to them say it all out loud. The lawyer laid out the timeline. The doctor, I'll get to the doctor, had signed a letter stating I lacked the capacity to manage my affairs. The hearing was set. Once the conservatorship went through, my wife would liquidate the redundant assets, which was a phrase he actually used, meaning the workshop and everything in it. Sebastian had already moved the bulk of the retirement accounts and the proceeds from a property we'd sold years ago. About $4.2 million, a number that made my breath catch even pretending to sleep, into a holding structure offshore in the Caymans, where my name didn't appear. My wife asked whether the old man would ever notice the accounts were empty. Sebastian said the old man hadn't logged into a bank account in 20 years and wasn't going to start now. And then my son said the thing that broke whatever was left. He said, "What about the test? Did the lawyers see the test?" And my wife said, sharp and fast, "We don't talk about the test." I didn't know what the test was. Not then. But the way she shut it down, the way my son went quiet and looked at his hands, that lodged in me like a splinter you can feel but can't find. When they left the room, I sat in the dark a long time. Then the aide wheeled me back and I tripped the switch off. And in the workshop the next afternoon I listened to all of it again. Twice. My good hand pressed flat against the bench to keep it from shaking. 4.2 million. A doctor bought and paid for. A wife who'd stopped being my wife somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. A son who wasn't. That splinter again. And here is the thing they did not know. The thing that, lying in that workshop, surrounded by the smell of varnish and old wood, made me laugh out loud for the first time in weeks, a laugh that scared me with how cold it was. They had emptied the accounts they knew about. They had not emptied the one they didn't. 30 years ago, a man named Cornelius Thorne found me. You won't have heard of him. That was the point of him. He was old money the way a glacier is old water. Vast, silent, and not interested in being seen. He didn't trust banks, didn't trust paper, didn't trust people, and somewhere in the lonely fortress of his money, he had developed an obsession with the one thing money can't manufacture, a perfect voice, a perfect cello. He found me through a quartet that played a benefit he'd funded. He sent a car. I met him in a hotel suite with the curtains drawn. An old man with eyes like wet slate, and he laid out what he wanted. Not a copy of a Stradivarius, not a museum piece, but a new instrument. The best that could be built by hand, that would still be singing in 200 years. He gave me 2 years, and no budget. I built him the cello I'd been dreaming of my whole life. I called it the Seraphim, for the way it sang in the low register. A sound like something grieving that is decided to forgive. When I drew the bow across it the first time, in that quiet workshop, I wept. I'm not ashamed to say it. When I delivered it, Thorne did not write me a check. Checks, he said, are how the small men keep score. He paid me a sum in cash that I told my wife was the whole fee, a respectable amount, 50,000, enough that she nodded and forgot about it. But the real payment was different. He told me a man who understood hidden things should understand hidden value. He had set up, in my name, in a private structure managed by his own people. An account I was never to touch unless the storm came. He gave me a single card with a number on it and a name to call. For the day, he said, when the people closest to you turn out to be the farthest. I thought he was a bitter old man talking to hear himself talk. I'd never touched it. Not once in 30 years. My workshop earned enough. I didn't need it. I'd let it sit and grow in the dark like a soundpost, doing its quiet structural work, holding up a future I couldn't see. I'd nearly forgotten the number was real. Thorne died 15 years ago. But I'd kept the card. It was taped, all this time, to the underside of the workbench drawer, behind a tray of broken pegs no thief would ever bother with. I peeled it off with my good hand. The number was still there. And under it, in Thorne's cramped, furious handwriting, a name I'd never had reason to think about. A name and a line he'd added the day he handed it to me, that I'd dismissed as the rambling of a man at war with his own family. If you ever need a hand the law won't lend, find my daughter. She became a judge to spite me. She'll do right by a craftsman, if only to prove me wrong. I sat very still, because I had read, 3 days earlier, in the legal notice the lawyer left on my own kitchen table, the name of the judge assigned to hear the conservatorship petition. It was the same name. I won't pretend I planned the next part like a chess game. I'm not that kind of man. But I knew tension, and I knew how to wait for the exact moment the wood is ready. And I knew that if I moved too soon, They'd freeze every account, throw out my recording as illegally obtained, paint me as a vengeful, confused old man, and bury me under their lawyer and their bought doctor until there was nothing left of me to bury. I needed someone the law would listen to. I needed an ally they couldn't buy or bully, and by some grace I still don't fully understand. The universe had set one in my path 30 years before I knew I'd need her. I called the number on the card from a cheap phone I had the aide by me, telling her it was for emergencies, which was true. A woman answered. I asked for the man whose name was written there, Thorne's old fixer, and was told he'd retired, but that the firm carried on. They gave me a name, Declan Bauer, an attorney who'd handled the Thorne estate for 2 decades, and, when I explained who I was, the man who built the Seraphim, went so quiet I thought the line had dropped. Mr. Thorne spoke of you, Bauer said finally. He kept the cello in a vault with the rest of his collection. He used to say you were the only honest man he'd ever met. Tell me what's happening. So I told him. All of it. The stroke, the meeting in the living room, the doctor, the offshore accounts, the conservatorship hearing in 11 days, and I told him about the recording. There was a long pause. Then Declan Bauer said the words that turned the whole thing around. Mr. Ashworth, the account Mr. Thorne established in your name has been actively managed since 1994. I'd have to pull the exact figure, but I can tell you, it is not $4 million. It hasn't been $4 million in a very long time. Now listen to me carefully. Do not move. Do not let them know anything has changed. Keep being exactly the man they think you are, for 11 more days. Can you do that? I told him I'd been doing it for 41 years. I just hadn't known. The hardest part was the doctor. The conservatorship rested on a single letter, a physician's statement that I lacked the capacity to manage my own life. The doctor who signed it had examined me once for 9 minutes, while I drooled on purpose and called him by the wrong name. But Bauer's people did what Bauer's people do. They pulled the doctor's history. They found that he had signed 3 other letters just like mine, in cases that had drained 3 other old men of their savings, 2 of them now dead in facilities. They found his connection to Sebastian. They built a picture, quietly, of a small machine that ate vulnerable people, and they got every piece of it notarized and sealed. And they found the test. The test my wife wouldn't talk about. A paternity result, ordered years ago by my son himself, who'd had a suspicion and confirmed it, that the boy I had raised, taught to drive, sat in the rain for, was not mine by blood. He'd known for 6 years. He'd kept it secret, and somewhere in that secret he'd decided that a man who wasn't really his father didn't deserve a father's fortune, and that taking it wasn't theft so much as correction. When Bauer told me on the phone, in the dark of the workshop, I didn't rage. The rage had burned down to something steadier. I just looked at the cello on the wall, the one with my recorder hidden in its dark, and I thought about how a thing can be hollow and still hold up a whole voice. The morning of the hearing, my wife dressed me herself. She put me in an old cardigan with a hole in the elbow and trousers that hung off me, slippers instead of shoes. She wanted me to look exactly like what the doctor's letter described, a ruin. A few of you watching will want to know why I let her, why I didn't put on my good suit and stand tall and shock them. I'll tell you. Because a craftsman knows you don't reveal the joinery until the piece is done. Let them see the wreck. Let them be sure. The more certain they were, the further they had to fall. They wheeled me into the courtroom like a piece of evidence. My wife sat at the petitioner's table in pearls, her face arranged into the noble, exhausted look of a woman doing a hard, loving thing. Beside her, Sebastian, in a suit that cost more than my first car, one hand resting on the back of her chair. And my son, in the second row, not meeting my eyes. The judge entered. I'd seen her photograph by then, but seeing her in person, the slate-gray eyes she'd inherited from a father she'd hated, I felt the whole architecture of 30 years lock into place. Judge Helena Thorne, she looked at the courtroom the way her father had looked at my blueprints, like she was finding the flaw. The petitioner's lawyer rose and made it sound so reasonable. A devoted wife. A tragic decline. A family forced to step in. He entered the doctor's letter. He gestured at me, the slumped old man in the moth-eaten cardigan, and asked the court to look. The court looked. I let my mouth hang open a little. Then he said the line that I will carry to my grave, because it was the last thing my wife ever said as a free woman. And she said it to me, turning in her chair, her voice ringing with 41 years of buried contempt, finally allowed out into the open. It's for his own good, she told the judge. Then, to me, low and vicious and certain, you'll never touch a dime of my money again. And Sebastian, God help him, smirked and said, just loud enough. That's the way it is, sweetheart. My son laughed. A short, nervous, ugly laugh. The three of them in a row, looking at the broken old man who dared to live this long. That's when my attorney stood up. They hadn't expected an attorney. The conservatorship was supposed to be unopposed. The respondent wasn't capable of opposing it. So when Declan Bauer rose from the back of the room in a charcoal suit and said, Your Honor, I represent Mr. Ashworth, and we'd like to be heard, the air in that room changed pressure. On what basis? The petitioner's lawyer sputtered. He's incompetent. There's a letter. There is a letter, Bauer agreed. We'd like to discuss the letter. He didn't shout. He never raised his voice. He laid it out the way I lay out a repair, one careful step at a time. He produced the doctor's record. 4 letters. 4 old men. A pattern. He produced the financial trail Sebastian thought was buried in the Caymans. $4.2 million routed through a holding company whose sole beneficiary was, when you peeled back 3 shells, my wife. He produced the offshore transfers, dated, signed, undeniable. And then he asked the court's permission to play a recording. My wife went white. Sebastian's hand came off the back of her chair. The courtroom filled with the sound of my own living room. The lawyer's voice laying out the timeline. Sebastian's voice saying the old man hadn't logged into an account in 20 years. My wife's laugh. 41 years married to a man who whittles. And now I finally get to be the one who decides. My son's voice asking about the test. I watched the certainty drain out of my wife's face the way color drains out of a face that's about to faint. I watched Sebastian lean over to his lawyer and hiss something. And I watched the lawyer shake his head. Because there was nothing to say. Judge Thorne let it play to the end. Then she set down the paper she'd been holding and folded her hands. And when she spoke quietly, which was somehow worse than shouting. Counselor, she said to the petitioner's lawyer, your client has just been recorded conspiring to use my court to defraud and imprison a competent man. She turned those slate eyes on the doctor, who'd come to testify and was now trying to be a piece of the wall. Doctor, your letter and your 3 previous letters are now part of a criminal referral. I'd advise you to find your own attorney. My wife shot to her feet. The mask was entirely gone now. I'd never seen her real face in 41 years. And there it was, raw and furious. This is my money, she screamed at the bench. I earned the right to it. He's a senile old fool who plays with dead men's toys. He'll never see a penny. The judge let the silence stretch. Then she said, on that one point, Mrs. Ashworth, you happen to be correct. My wife froze. A wild, ridiculous flicker of hope crossed her face. He will never see a penny of what you stole, Judge Thorne said, because he doesn't need it. She picked up a sealed folder that Declan Bauer had handed forward, and she opened it, and she read, and something happened to her face that I will treasure as long as I live. A faint, private flicker of something almost like a smile. Not at my wife, but at me. It appears, she said, that while you were busy emptying the accounts you knew about, you overlooked the one you didn't. Mr. Ashworth has been the sole beneficiary of a privately managed trust since 1994, established by a client in payment for a commissioned work. According to this notarized statement, that trust is presently valued at just over $21 million. $21 million. 5 times what they'd schemed and lied and risked prison to steal. I watched my wife understand it. I watched her understand that the dusty toy she'd sneered at for 4 decades had quietly built the fortune she'd never get her hands on. I watched her understand that the man who'd commissioned that work was the father of the woman in the black robe, the client, the judge said. And now she did look at my wife directly. Was my father. The instrument Mr. Ashworth built for him is the finest in his collection. I have heard it played. My father did not respect many men. He respected this one. Then she set down the folder and turned to the bailiffs. Take all 3 into custody, she said. Conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. We'll let the district attorney sort out the rest. I won't dress up what came after because some of you will want to know exactly, and you deserve to. It was not over in that room. It took 14 months. But it ended. The doctor surrendered his license and pled guilty to a healthcare fraud charge. He got 4 years and is serving them. Sebastian, who turned out to have done this twice before in 2 other states, was convicted of conspiracy and grand larceny and is serving 11 years. The $4.2 million was clawed back every cent out of the Cayman structure that Bauer's people unwound like a bad seam, and it was returned to me, though by then I scarcely needed it. My wife pled guilty to fraud and perjury. 41 years. And she stood in an orange jumpsuit and would not look at me. She got 6 years. The divorce, which I filed the week after the hearing in which she could not contest from a cell, was final inside a year. She walked away with what the law allowed her and not 1 dime more, and that was very little. And my son. The boy I'd raised who was not my blood and who had known it for 6 years and let it turn him into this. He took a plea, cooperated against the others, and got 2 years probation and a felony on his record. He came to the workshop once after and stood in the doorway and said he was sorry and asked if there was any way back. I looked at him a long time. I told him the truth, which is the only gift I had left to give him. I told him that blood had never been what made him mine. That I'd chosen him 3,000 times over 30 years, and that he was the one who decided to be someone else's. I told him I forgave him, because carrying it would cost me more than it cost him, and I meant it. But I told him there was no way back, and there wasn't. Forgiveness and a future are not the same thing. He left. I haven't seen him since, some nights that cost me more than all the rest of it put together. I'm 70 now. I live alone outside Saratoga Springs, in the same house with the workshop still standing behind it. My right hand never fully came back. I work slower than I used to, and I've taken on 2 young apprentices to do what my fingers no longer can. The 21 million did something I never expected of money. It gave me a way to mean something past my own life. I used it to start a foundation, the Thorne Ashworth Fund, for young craftsmen and craftswomen with the gift in their hands and nothing in their pockets. Luthiers, woodworkers, the ones the world calls hobbyists, right up until it needs something built that lasts. Judge Thorne sits on the board. She told me, the day she signed on, that her father would have hated it, which is exactly why she wanted to do it. And we both laughed, and I think we were laughing at the same old slate-eyed ghost. People ask me if I feel triumphant. I don't, much. Triumph is a young man's word. What I feel when I draw the bow across an instrument I've just finished and it answers me true is something quieter and harder to name. They thought patience was weakness. They thought a man who works with his hands instead of his elbows is a man who can be moved. They never understood the soundpost, the small hidden piece, the soul of the thing, that holds up the whole voice from the inside where nobody thinks to look. I was never the broken old man in the cardigan. I was the one who knew exactly where the soul was, and how to keep it standing, and how long to wait in the dark before I let it sing. The hardest thing to accept wasn't that my wife wanted my money. It was how ordinary the wanting looked from the inside, how patiently it grew, fed by every year I spent assuming love was a thing you could stop tending and trust would hold on its own. Sebastian didn't ruin my marriage. He found a door already standing open, and the son I raised didn't turn into a stranger overnight. He became one a little at a time, each small lie making the next one easier, until the man standing in the orange jumpsuit was simply who all those lies had quietly built. That's how ruin actually works. It's never one big decision. It's 100 small ones, and the people making them almost never notice the moment they cross from cutting corners to cutting throats. I survived them for reasons that had nothing to do with luck. When I lay in that bed and chose to keep my mouth shut instead of screaming, that wasn't weakness. It was the same discipline I'd spent 50 years learning at my bench. You don't force the wood, you wait for it to be ready. Patience isn't passivity. It's the most aggressive thing a calm man can do. I let them stay certain, because certainty makes people careless, and careless was exactly what I needed them to be. But waiting alone would have earned me nothing. What truly saved me was that I had spent my whole life being a man worth Cornelius Thorne's trust. He didn't leave that fortune to a clever schemer. He left it to someone who'd built him something honest and never once tried to squeeze him for more. The seed of my rescue was planted 30 years before I knew I'd need it, by the plain act of doing my work right when nobody was watching. You don't get to pick the day your character pays off. You only get to decide, long before then, whether you built any worth paying out. And there's a kind of strength nobody warns you about. It's the strength it takes, after the verdict, to set the bitterness down. I could have spent my last years gnawing on what they did to me. Instead, I drew a bow across a finished cello and let it sing, took on 2 young apprentices with talent and empty pockets, and forgave my son even knowing there was no road back. That choice cost me more than the lawsuit ever did, but hatred is a debt that compounds, and I was finished paying interest to people who had already taken enough. So if you take one thing from an old man who was nearly erased, take this. Tend what you love before it goes hungry. Keep your hands clean in the dark, because the dark is where it counts. And build the patience to wait, and the courage to forgive, not because they earned it, but because you deserve to walk out of that courtroom free of them. The soundpost holds up the whole voice from the inside, where no one thinks to look. So does a life.